Alright, good morning and welcome everybody. We're going to talk about some review of defining some functions, specifically in regards to mathematical functions. We're going to talk about how you can use mathematical functions, the math library, how you can return values, how you can basically convert local to global variables, or at least return a value in a function that is local and convert that to a global variable that can be used inside of a larger program. Lastly, we're going to talk about how we can basically create a custom library of functions that we can then call upon in a different project or a different file entirely. Alright, let's get to it. First thing that we're going to do is in Visual Studio here, we're going to create a new file. So I'm still in my regular Python solution that I've used in the past. I named it Babby's First Python. I'm just going to right click on the entry right here and go to Add. And when I go to Add, I'm going to add a new item, and I'm going to call this Custom Math Library in camel case like this. So I'm calling it Custom Math Library.py. We're creating our own library here. Basically, I'm going to define some functions that we could call in another project. So first I'm going to do what I always do, put my initials, put the date, and this is going to be a custom math library. We're going to do some very, very basic math in this. I'm going to create an addition function, and I'm going to create a subtraction function. Alright, so first things first, the addition function. To create a function, we simply use the def command, and that defines a function. In this case, I'm going to define something called addition. Now you'll notice addition, it's going to be called now custom math library.addition. So if I wanted to use this in another project, I would have to import this custom math library, and then I would be able to use this addition function. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make it to where we have two parameters in the addition function. There's going to be the p1 or parameter 1 and a parameter 2. I'm listing that there are two numbers that we put into this function. p1 and p2 is how it's known in here. And what's going to happen is we're simply going to add those together. So right here I'm going to put total, which is going to be the variable, the local variable to this function that it will be the addition of these two objects. So right here I'm going to say total equals p1 plus p2. So what is this doing? It's creating a variable called total. That's what the name on the bucket is. And the bucket's contents are p1 plus p2. So whatever you put into these two parameters right here will be added together. In fact, I'm going to make it explicit, and I'm going to print out a little message. It's going to say print adding. I'm going to use a comma to delimit a different parameter that's going to be passed into print. I'm going to put p1. Then I'll put a quote. I'll put another string right here, and I'll put p2. And I'll put, just for punctuation's sake, I'll put this quote in here too. So what we have is, it's going to make the total. You're going to pass two parameters in, p1 and p2. It's going to take those two parameters, add them together, and store them in this total variable. And then it's going to print out that it's adding parameter 1, and it's going to be adding parameter 2. These are all strings, so it's going to show this, then a space, then this, then a space, then this, then a space, then this, then a space, and this. We could do this with concatenation, but this is just another way to do it in shorthand. Lastly, I'm also going to print out that the total is now, and I will put the total variable here. So right here, this total is just the name of the variable. In this case, it's going to be print, or it's going to be whatever these two integers added together would be. Alright, now the last part. What happens is we put our two parameters in, but all that's happening is it's going to be sending these messages to us. We actually want it to return a value so we can use this. So I'm going to say return total. So after we're done with running this this function, it's going to actually return a value at the end, and we can use this in our main program to convert a local variable, which you see here, this total right here. We can convert that local variable into a global variable in scope, and we'll talk about how we can do that. So right now, let's just try this function out. What I'm going to do is I'm going to make a little prompt at the beginning of our program. I'm going to define our functions here, and then I'm going to create another program that uses this function. So right now, let's test that out. I'm going to create a new program or a new file. So I'm going to once again right-click over here on Babby's First Python, and I'm going to create a new add, a new file, new item, and I'm just going to call this, for its name, I'm going to call it math test. That's going to be the name of it here. We all fear math tests, but imagine if we had a program that would do all of the math for us. So the first thing that I'm going to do is, of course, I'm going to put my initials, I'm going to put the date, and I'm going to call this math test. And this is simply testing out the custom math functions that we just created. So to do that, I'm first going to import the custom library that we just made. The custom library is right here, and right now it's pretty sparse. We only have one definition in here of one function, but let's see how we can use it. If we go into our math test Python file here, I'm going to set it as the startup file, so that way when we press F5 and try to debug, it will actually run this program. So I'm going to click on math test, and I'm going to go down to set as startup file. There we go. Now it's in bold, so you can see it's emboldened there, and when I press F5, it will run this file. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to import custom math library, which is what we just created just a moment ago, and there it is. So now everything that was in this code, this separate file that I made, this math library file, now that's going to be usable in this program right here. Just like we did with the random function, we now have the power of our custom math library that we created. What we're going to do is we're going to try out our addition. So I'm going to say print, or actually, I'm going to store a variable. So we'll say added numbers equals, and I'm going to use the custom math library dot addition. And this is the function that we just wrote a moment ago. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Let me finish this and I'll help you out. Alright, so we have this custom math library, and in that math library we wrote this function called addition. Now in order to run this we need two parameters. So for right now I'm just going to put 2 and 5. And it's going to save the outcome of this into a variable called added numbers. So basically what's happening is it's using the function that we just wrote, where it's going to add 2 to the number 5, and it's going to save those in this added numbers variable right here. So if we wanted to print that added numbers variable, we can see what the outcome would be. So right now it's going to simply run, and it's going to put 2 and 5 in, and it's going to print those added numbers together. Let's see if we run it, if it comes out. And there we go. We can see that it says adding 2 and 5. The total is now 7. And then down here where it says print added numbers, that's where this 7 comes from. That third line is simply printing out the value of this variable, which we stored right here by running this whole thing. So now let's see how we can mess around with this a little bit. I'm going to make it to where there's a variable called number1, and I'm going to set it to an input. So I'm going to say number1 equals input. Please enter the value of number1. I'll also put a /n in there to make it skip a line. And I'm going to make a number2 as well. And because I'm lazy efficient, I'm just going to copy and paste this. It's going to say the same thing twice, but there's going to be number1 and number2. Now the number1 and number2, I'm going to put those in the parameter values over here for your added numbers. So right here, it's going to add the numbers of number1 and number2 as the two parameters that are passed into this function. So here we have imported our custom library where we created addition, and now we're creating two variables right here that are going to store those parameters, and you get to put them in each time you run the program. So let me mark some comments here. This is going to store variables for math functions, and this is actually passing those variables into the custom function as parameters. So the things that go inside of the parentheses right here, we're having the program ask, what do you want the first number to be? What do you want the second number to be? And it's going to store those numbers up here. That way when it actually runs our custom function, it's going to use those variables, the things that it asked you for, to actually get our total. Now this is great because we can do a whole bunch of different things with this. If we wanted to make it to where you're in a video game and you wanted to make it to where you had a health amount, or you had a damage rating, or you had items that gave you more magic power or something, you can make it to where those things are saved as variables, and now when you actually click on an enemy and you want to deal damage to it, you have a function that you created that does all the math for you. It checks to see how powerful is the weapon that you're striking with, how much health or how much defense does the enemy have, how much is there a level difference between the characters? Is that going to turn into some kind of advanced math function that changes what you can do and what you can't do in a video game? All these kind of things are very important depending on what kind of thing you're trying to make. And let's not even start to think about what we can do with the real world. I mean, think about plugging in functions to be able to do physics calculations. That's how we got to the moon. All those kinds of things that we have to think about in order to do things in the physical realm can be processed by computers here. So in this case, we have our two variable numbers here, number1 and number2. It's going to ask us what the value of those are, and then it's going to take those two numbers and plug them into the function that we just made. Let's try running it and see what happens. Oh, there's one thing that's going to go wrong though. The thing that's going to go wrong is when we ask this prompt right here, it's going to take number1 and it's going to make it equal to the input of this. It's going to be a string going in. When you type in the number of a prompt like this to an input, it's going to come out as a string, so that's going to cause some problems because it's going to try to add two strings together, and that's not going to work. So what we need to do is we need to make this into an integer. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to put int, and I'm going to make that encapsulate this input right here. So I want to take whatever input you put in, and I want to turn it into an integer. That's what I'm going to save this number as. So now you see when I hover over the number, it now says number1 int when I hover over the value. If I didn't have this int right here, it wouldn't change it into that. In fact, let me just show you. If I take that int out and put the parentheses out of there, now when I hover over this number1, you'll see that it's a string type. When you use the input method right here, the input function, it stores what you type in as a variable, but it always saves it as a string. So if you want to convert it, you have to cast it now by turning it into an integer. That way it's just working with numbers instead of characters. We talked a little bit about how ASCII characters are stored. It's different than integers. Alright, so now I can see that number1 is an integer, number 2 is an integer. Down here it's going to pass those integers into our addition function, and it's going to print what the outcome is. Let's see how it runs. So I press F5, and now it says, please enter the value of number 1. This is the first line of the code that we actually are using right here. We can see it right here in line 7. It's going to ask, please enter the value. So I'm going to put 7. Now it says, please enter the value of number 2. I'm going to put in 9. Now it says adding 7 and 9. It's actually running that custom math library function that we created. It's adding those numbers together. The total is now 16. And now we have this print added numbers. Added numbers has been assigned the name of the bucket that is holding the outcome of our addition function. So it says 16 right here. Excellent. So how can we use this in a gaming function? Let's see. I'm going to make something called random damage in our math functions here. Or maybe random subtraction. So I'm going to go back into my math library right here. And I'm going to create a new definition. I'm going to make it a random subtraction function. So what I'll do first is, for this math library, I'm going to import random. And now when I use the math library, it's also going to import random automatically. So let's see if we can do this. I'm going to define a function called subtract random. And I'll actually capitalize both of them like this. There we go. And just like before, there's going to be a parameter 1, and there's going to be a parameter 2. Alright, so what I want to do is, I'm going to make the total. Actually, I'm going to make it choose a random number first. So I'm going to make a variable called rand. And I'm going to make it equal to our trusty rand int function. And I'm going to make it from between 0, or I'll make it from between 1 and parameter 2. So parameter 2 is going to be the range. In fact, I'm going to change what it says now. Instead of making it called parameter 2, I'm going to make it called range. So that way when I look at the function, I can see what it is actually asking for. I'll also make P1, I'll change the name of that to initial. So now there's an initial value, and there's a range parameter that should also be put in. As you can see here, I'm making the range function right here. I'm going to plug that in to where the random integer goes up to. So when you run this function, you're going to put in 2 parameters. One of them is going to be a regular number, and the second one is going to be used as the place for the range that the random integer can be assigned to. So if I wanted to make my number go from 1 to 100, my second parameter that I put into this function should be 100. And then it'll make it to where it'll choose between 1 and 100. Alright, so what I want it to do is, I want to make my total, and it's going to equal the initial variable, which is the first parameter right here. It's going to take that and it's going to subtract the random number that I created up here. So basically you put in your initial number and the range of the random number, and it's going to take that initial number and subtract whatever random number it gets right here. Lastly, I want it to return the total. Alright, I want it to explicitly say what's happening, so I'm going to put in some print functions here. What I'll do is I'll type in random number created, value, and I'll make it type out what the random value is. In fact, I'll put created between 1 and I'll make it actually show what the range is. So it's going to say random number created between 1 and whatever the second parameter is in the function, which is the range. And then it's going to say what the value is. I'll also make it formatted a little nice. I'll put the /ns in there. There we go. So it's going to create a random number. Good morning, Devin. It's printing the random number is created between, and it says what the range is, and then it says what the random number is. Then I want it to actually print what the total is, so it's going to say subtracting, and we want the initial variable, and we want to subtract that randomly generated variable. And lastly, we want to print out what the total is. The total is now, and we'll put what the end is there. Alright, and more importantly, it's going to return that total so we can use it later on in our project. So right here, it's just, let's recap what it is we just wrote. We wrote a function where you put in two parameters. You put in the initial value and you put in the range. So in this case, it's going to choose a random number, a random integer between 1 and that range that you put in right here as your second parameter. It's going to save that as a variable called rand. Then it's going to create a variable called total, and it's going to take the first parameter that you pass into this function, and it's going to subtract that random value that was created right here from that initial variable, or that initial parameter right here. Then it's going to explain what it did. It's going to say, hey, a random number was created, and its value is this, and we're going to subtract the number that you passed in at the beginning. So I should probably say this a little bit differently. Subtracting, we probably want to subtract the random variable from the initial variable. That would make more sense in the English language here. So we're subtracting the random number from the initial number, and the total is now, and it's going to list out the value of this variable that we just created. And it's going to return that so we can use it in our program. Let's check it out. I'm going to save this. I'm going to go back into my math test here, and let's try it out. I'm going to create a subtracted numbers, and I'm going to save this, or I'm going to make it run the custom math library that we just created, dot, and you can see when we put dot in, it shows all the functions that are inside of our custom math library right here that we're referring to. So right here you can now see there's a subtract random function. If I click on that, you can see that there is a new function, and it lists out, alright, you're going to have an initial parameter and you're going to have a range parameter right here. It lists out the names of the parameters that we put in. This can be very helpful because you could put in parameters that have a specific meaning, like if you're going to be coding a game that it has turn-based combat or something, you can have it to where you put in the attacker's weapon value, and you could have the other parameters be the player health or the defense rating of the defender's armor, that kind of thing. So you could actually list out what they're supposed to be so it's not so confusing for somebody who's trying to put in the appropriate things in the appropriate parameter value. So I know that my first parameter has to be the initial number, and the second one is going to be the range. So let's try it out. I'm just going to use the numbers that I already have. I'm just going to use number 1 and number 2 because I already have it ask that up here in my program. It's going to use these two variables, number 1 and number 2, passing into the parameter list. So number 1 is going to be the initial number, and number 2 is going to be the range that the random number can be created from. So it's going to ask me in my program what number 1 and number 2 is. Now I know that number 2 is going to be the range of the random number. And lastly, I'll have it print out the subtracted numbers variable. So we can see that we can use the subtracted numbers later in my code if I wanted to add it to something else. For example, I could pass it in as a parameter for another function. Let's try it out. So right now we have our added numbers that will run. Let's see if the subtracted numbers one works. So right now it's going to ask me for the value of number 1, which is going to be the initial value. I'll put 5. Now it's going to say the value of number 2. I'm going to put 100 because I want it to choose a random number between 1 and 100. Let's see how it works. So our first function runs through, the adding function. It's going to add 5 and 100. And now the total is 105. I'm sorry, 105. I got to be proper here. So now it's saying that a random number is created between 1 and 100, which is my second number value here. You can see that the second number is passed in to the function right here, and it's passed into the second area of the parameter list, which is our range, if you remember. So now it says, all right, the value is 19. That's the random number that it created. It picked a number between 1 and 100. The value of that random number is 19. Now it's subtracting 19 from 5, which was the first number that I put in here. And the total is now negative 14. So we had it doing our math for us. We have a way for us to be able to tell the computer to do any kind of advanced mathematical function that we want to. We can just go into our custom math library and we can type in any sequence of math that we want it to do. We want it to take your player health and we want it to take the attack rating of an enemy that strikes you and then compare it to the armor that you're wearing and then come out with the actual amount of damage that will come out of your health bar, for example. We can do all of that in a function like this by writing out the logic of what we want the math to do. And then inside of our actual game, we can have it just call that function and pass the appropriate numbers into the parameter list. Fantastic. Alright, so we talked about how you can define functions. We talked about math functions. We talked about returning values. Now we have these values called added numbers and subtracted numbers that we saved into this program right here. And if we want to use those as parameters, check this out. We can take these numbers that we just created, the added numbers and the subtracted numbers. We can now use those as parameters. So I'm going to try that right now. I'm going to simply print, or I'm going to make combined functions, function variables, and I'm going to make that into a subtract random function that uses those two parameters. So I'm going to make one of them added numbers and the other one subtracted numbers. So what is this doing? Let's take a look at this, because when you look at this in a code, when you look at this in when you start to get into bigger programs, you're going to see a lot of stuff like this where it looks incredibly confusing. Like if you were to come into this without the training that you have so far, you would look at this line of code and be like, wow, I have no idea what this does. But let's check out how it works. Right now what it's doing is it's taking these two variables that we created, added numbers and subtracted numbers, and it's going to actually pass those into our custom function as parameters. So the answer to our first added numbers function right here, adding these two numbers together, that's going to be the initial variable of our subtraction function. Then it's going to take the result of our subtracted numbers function, and it's going to pass that in as the range of our subtracted numbers. So if we run this, we can now print out the variable of combined variables, and we can see what comes out as a result. It's using our numbers, our two variables that we have here, to add together to subtract as a random function, but then it's also taking the answers to those two problems and it is making another response. Amazing. So this is where the return part comes in. Right here where you have the return totals for these functions, that's because we want to be able to pass them in and use them later on in our code. So right here where we have this added numbers variable and this subtracted numbers variable, the reason we're doing that is we might want to actually use that in our main code later on. We don't want to just have it print out this one function. We might actually want to use these numbers later on in our program. So let's see what happens when we do this. Should be pretty interesting to watch. Close this. There we go. Alright, so now it says, please enter the value of number 1. I'm going to put in 5. Please enter the value of number 2. I'll put in 100. Oh, we've got a problem here. Empty range for rand range 1 to negative 50. Ah, the problem is that we are entering a range that is negative sometimes. Because with this subtraction part right here, subtract random, when it subtracts up here, it's coming up with a negative variable, and we don't want to have that here. Alright. We might have to change this a little bit. What I'm going to do is, I'm going to use the same variable in our math test here. I'm going to make added numbers the same parameter, or the same variable for both parameters. Just to keep it positive right now. So this also shows you that you can have the same number or the same variable in two different parameter listings. Now it's going to take our added numbers, the variable, the value inside of that bucket, and it's going to subtract a random number that goes from 1 to that value. So let's try it one more time. Alright, so it says please enter the value of number 1. So I'll put 100. Please enter the value of number 2. I'll put 100. Alright, so it's adding 100 and 100. So the total is now 200. And it's actually posting what that variable is just printed by itself. So that's what is shown right here, where it shows just the number. Then it says random number created between 1 and 100. The value is 32. It's subtracting 32 from 100. The total is now 68. So a random number is created between 1 and 200, which is that initial thing that we put in, or the added number right here. It's going to be adding, or it's going to be choosing a number between 1 and 200. Now why 200? Because we passed the added numbers into the range of what happens when it picks out a random number. So now as you can see here, it's picking a random number between 1 and 200. Its value is 153. It's going to subtract 153 from 200, and the total is now 47. So that's the value of this combined function variables. It's now 47. We have different numbers going on, and it's all based upon pseudo-randomized logic with our functions, where it creates a random number between a number that you pick in a range. But you can begin to see how we can do a lot with mathematics once you start being able to create your own custom functions. You can say, alright, when you make a number, I want it to do this, and add this to that, and maybe multiply this to that, depending on what the problem is that you're trying to solve. As long as you know the method of what you're supposed to do, and what you're supposed to measure, you can create custom functions that do really anything with numbers. And you can use them in multiple projects, so you can create your own custom library, and then you can start to call them in different projects, so you don't have to write the same custom function over and over again. This is a very basic function to where we're just showing how you can add and subtract numbers, but you can go on beyond this, and there's a whole bunch of things you can do. In fact, if we go into our custom math library, I'm going to go to the top of this page, and I'm going to import a library called math. Import math. And math is a library that already has a bunch of math functions. Let's check out what's in there. In order to see what's in there, I'm just going to put math and a period, and you can see all the different things that are included in a math library, in the standard math library. And in this case, if I just use the arrow keys, I can go up and down and see what there are. I can hover over them and see what they are. In this case, a cos returns the arc cosine. And what does it have? You put in one parameter value right here, and it will give you the arc cosine of it. So it's just like a calculator, really, all these things. There's tangents, there's cosine, there's degrees, so it'll convert an angle from radian to degrees. There's all kinds of different functions that are in the math library that you can use. There is no add function because, of course, we just use the plus or minus usually. But I wanted to show you that you can create a custom function that can do any mathematical operation you want. This is a useful one right here, the square root function. You can use the square root function to find the square root of something, and we'll probably use that later. For now, let's just recap what we did. We created our own functions in a custom library. Then we created another file here that summons that custom library, and it uses those functions that we created, and it passes through parameters that we asked for earlier in the program. So we asked for the number that you plug in, and then it plugs in those numbers, those variable values, into the functions here, and it actually uses the outcome of those functions as parameters down here, or added numbers right here. It prints it out, it stores it right here, and it uses this number down here in this function one more time. So this is a way for you to be able to check to see how functions work and how to play around with them. We can do a lot of fun things with numbers once you begin to understand how you can create your own custom functions and how you can have those functions interact with other variables. I hope you have fun coding, and if you have any questions, just let me know. Have a great Thanksgiving.